We're so much better together.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of the conversations we're doing called Race in America. I think all of us recognize that racial tensions and racial issues have been a part of our history from the beginning of this country, from the first time people arrived on the shores, from slavery to Civil War to Reconstruction to Jim Crow laws to tensions between law enforcement and people of color, to Black Lives Matter, to poverty issues, all kinds of things going on in our nation that we've had to wrestle with and deal with and continue to face. And so we're having these conversations as an effort to bring us together, to hear each other. And you know, as the church, in all those processes that we've been in as a country, the church has been right in the middle of it, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But today, in our city, as churches and as church leaders, we're trying to come together and bring our city together, bring people together, look and search for answers to be able to move together forward in healthy ways. And today I have the privilege of introducing you guys to two friends of mine who are both bridge builders here in our city and beyond. Jeff Denton is the pastor of Waterbrook Fellowship and is also a quasi police chaplain in our city and interacts with and works with a lot of officers in our city and does a great job with that. And Jason Earls is a comedian and also a pastor, which sometimes goes together and sometimes doesn't. But anyway, so these guys are both bridge builders, and I'm just so thankful for them and thankful for their efforts, thankful for their friendship, and thank you guys very much for being here. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Keith.
Why don't you just take a moment just to introduce yourselves a little bit, tell everybody a little bit about you, and we'll go from there. So, Jason, you want to start?
Okay, all right. I was going to yield to the senior. So yes, I am Jason Earls. I've been born and raised in Portsmouth, Virginia. I moved to Dallas to go to grad school in '99. Then went back home, get my wife for 2 years, came back. Moved up to Seattle for 4 years before moving back to Dallas once again. I've been doing family ministry, been doing youth ministry. Now I'm doing teaching pastor ministry, in addition to telling jokes to the folks all across the country, and now I reside here in the Murphy-Wiley area.
Great.
Yep.
Thank you again for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Jeff?
Well, I was raised in Central Illinois, the cornfields of Central Illinois, and after my first degree is in broadcasting, so a short career in broadcasting, and then God called me into ministry about 30 years ago, and so that's what I've been doing ever since. Ministered in Chicago church for 20 years, and with my wife up there, and then we came to Wiley in 2008 to Waterbrook, and so we have 2 kids and 2 young adult kids who are sort of now out on their own, and it's nice to be an empty nester and a new season of life.
Yeah, that's great.
What is an empty nester? I have no idea.
How many children do you have?
I have 6 kids, half a dozen. The ages from 18, 16, 15, 13, 10, and 9.
Boom. Got it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's jump in here. You guys have both been what I call bridge builders, unifiers, really your whole adult lives. And that, just talk a little bit about that journey, what that's been like for you. Why does that matter so much to you? Why is that so important to you? Just Jeff, why don't you start?
Well, having been raised in a rural area, it's not that I wasn't exposed to racism, but in my family it just was not allowed. It was identified as early as I can remember that it was wrong. Mm-hmm. And so that was just the heart that I grew up with. It was something that was wrong. It was something that was a sin. And so I had that upbringing. And then when I went to Chicago, I had the tremendous opportunity to minister alongside some incredible leaders who were at the forefront of bringing ministries together, of uniting different races, was in a church where we actually then planted different ethnic churches within our church that we would then bring together and worship all in one service, sort of, and have communion together. But then at other times we're apart in different languages, and so I've had this wonderful opportunity and experience to be able to integrate with different cultures and be involved. And the other part of that, I really do believe, is being involved in missions work, and you know that as well, Keith. When you do a lot of traveling outside the country and you go to different areas, it starts to break down your idea of what is Christian, of what is American, of what is white or black or Asian or what have you. You're able to break down, well, guess what? A suit and tie is not what everyone wears to preach. It's not what everyone wears to church. And when I'm in Asia, I wear a skirt. I wear a dress to teach because
I need a picture of that.
Right.
I need a picture of that.
Is it a denim one?
It is not. It is, but to wear a longi in those cultures, it really breaks down what is more important for you, and it allows people to break down barriers. I had a college professor who said to me, "You don't know who you are until you've been somewhere else."
Yeah.
And you've lived among
That's
other
so
people,
good.
you've been with other people, because if all you know is your own culture, then you don't think any broader than that, and you think your culture is the right culture.
Absolutely.
And so I think for me it's all of that put together. It's, by the grace of God, a wonderful pot of experiences that are all stirred together that have just always given me a tender heart for people who are different from me, and understanding that.
That's good. It's so true, because my wife and I, we lived in Hong Kong for 5 years, where we were clearly the minority. And it just changes your perspective. It absolutely changes your perspective. So, yeah, it's so good. So, Jason, what about you? Your journey as a unifier, and why is that so important to you? Talk a little bit about that.
It's interesting. In my town, in Virginia, it's very heavily populated black and white. My middle school I went to was probably half and half. I'm sorry, not middle school, elementary school. In 5th grade, my best friend was a white girl named Amy Harvey. And we talked about wrestling. She was a big wrestling fan, as was I, and that was our common bond. But once we got to middle school, we didn't say 2 words to each other. It was just that dynamic in that middle school. Like, we just didn't talk. Just black and white students.
It was just
it was separation, man. And although the community somewhat lived together cordially, in the heart, we didn't. I went to one white classmate's house. My first time ever in a white person's home was when I was in 4th grade. The next time was when I was in college, and that was to smoke something. So that's the dynamic. And once I really got serious with my relationship with the Lord, listened to Him, and started getting into ministry, I saw the world different in the way that He wanted it to be. Understanding that we were all unified, even though we have different backgrounds, God's called all of us to be one. And so my heart just broke for that reality in my hometown, as well as all over the world, and particularly here in America. So I just started making sure that I prioritized having other relationships. I wanted my children to grow up with them being able to see that mom and dad didn't just talk about loving all people, but it was exemplified in our relationships. So now my parents did that somewhat, but then when my dad was in the military, my brother's godfather was my dad's white army buddy. But he lived in New Jersey, we lived in Virginia. We didn't see him that often. So now I just long so bad for us, for the body of Christ to be what we're supposed to be. That's kind of, I want to see the Bible lived out. I just don't want to say that we believe this stuff and never see it happen.
Absolutely. I love that. I got that same heart, man. That's why we're sitting here. So I know from personal experience that being a bridge builder, a unifier, It's so awesome when it happens and we experience it, but there's also some heartbreak with it. There's some pain. Talk a little bit about that for you guys, your process with that. How's that been for you? Jason, why don't you start this time?
The process in bridge building, the difficulty shows up when there's some folks who just don't get it. Mm-hmm. And it's heartbreaking to see brothers and sisters who are blinded to it. I'm the president of the Christian Comedy Association. I know most people don't think that exists. But there are comedians all across the country. I'm the first black president of this organization. And my goal is to try to unify this group, but then different conversations that I'm having. It's some things are said. There's one friend, if I can call him that, who posted some things, and I just said, hey man, you and I have had conversations. We've actually been on a road trip together. You've never presented yourself as racist, but everything about what you've just written looks, smells, sounds just like it, man. And he wasn't even aware of that. And when we try to have those conversations, it's normally just, I can't listen to your side. Here's what I think. This is what I've always thought. And you're biased because of where you come from. Those are the heartbreaks. And even when I believe God's called my wife and I to live in a diverse community so that we can be an example to individuals in our community. Hey, there's some black people that live here too.
Yeah, quite a few.
But yeah, there when you just knock on your neighbor's house door and they call the police on you because a suspicious man knocked on the door. Those things it's like, man, sometimes you wonder, man, is my living in vain? What's the point? Is it really working?
Because you've actually had some things in your own neighborhood that have been challenging and difficult.
Yeah. So when my neighbor called the police on me, the police came out to the neighborhood and asked, hey, I was sitting in my front yard. What are you doing out here? Well, I'm in my front yard. Can you prove it? So so you don't think I belong in this neighborhood. Don't go in the house and get your license. Just give me your name and date of birth so I can call it in. Just in my front yard, man. They're just humiliating, infuriating, just all things like that, things that my kids have experienced right here in our town on a baseball team. Just being called inappropriate, outside of who he is. We can go on about the heartbreak, but there's just, there's so many things that break my heart. And striving to be a bridge builder, being unified, what people assume, and the strength that has to be displayed to overcome that is, in recent weeks and days, in fact, I've discovered that it takes an amazing amount of strength from God to strive towards unity, because there's always something to upset you that probably could send you back to your default racial settings, let me say it like that. So.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I want to come back to you because I think you have more to say about that. So, Jeff, why don't you jump in here? As a unifier, that's challenging at times and painful.
Yeah, I don't want to suppose or in any way pretend that my pain or my inconvenience is equal to Jason's, because it's not. It's completely different. The experience,
but it's yours and it's real.
I was about to say the same thing. It's okay, brother. We're brothers. We're brothers, everybody. We talk. Right. He's a good guy, but they're both good guys. So,
but it is completely different when we talk about what my pain would be. My pain is when we did with Heaven's Journey Fellowship the first Black History Month service that we did to celebrate.
And Heaven's Journey is a primarily African American church.
Yes, right. And so we hosted so they could have a bigger facility, and we did some combined stuff together, and we did that for a few years.
Wondering, your church is a primarily white church, right?
Primarily,
okay.
yes.
All
yes,
right.
absolutely.
Just going to clarify.
Yes, that's a good point, yes. And so when we announced that in the community and it was publicized, to get hateful letters and talk about how we shouldn't do that, and there's no need for a Black History Month or a service in our community, and that's painful.
Yeah.
That's painful.
Yeah.
But I think the pain for me comes as a pastor is I really try, I think I in general give people the benefit of the doubt. I assume, especially if you're a believer, that you have a heart for this, that you have a heart for unity among people. And it is, the interesting thing about the pandemic is we've had these conversations, and you were at our church, and we did a broadcast with some African-American pastors that are all dear to my heart. And we had some great conversations to hear afterwards, people who I assume the best for. And I think if they were face to face with me, we would talk about it. Mm-hmm. But because of the pandemic and isolation, people instead will write and will say something they would never say. That face to face we'd have a conversation that I think they would get my heart as a pastor, and instead they're just coming, I think, from a sinful place in their heart, and they say things, and there's not an actual dialogue. Right. And and in some of the responses we've gotten to that broadcast we did that was over, I think 2 hours and 45 minutes of dialogue and discussion, and some preaching that Jason did as part of it, and then some panel discussion, that people have so much hatred and anger. Shocks me. Yeah. I don't understand how someone who could love Christ, and people who I genuinely believe love Christ, don't grasp equality, don't understand Micah 6:8. I mean, the concept of justice and mercy and humility. And people who I think get that in other areas of their life, and then over here in this area, they don't. Mm-hmm. And as a pastor, that hurts my heart. And it's not that I don't have sins that I struggle with. It's just in that arena, like with everything, I want to assume the best about everyone.
Absolutely.
And I want to assume that everyone gets this, and I realize everyone doesn't. That's a pain to me, because that also says, as a pastor, right. And for the last 30 years, I've not done a great job at times of discipling and preaching and communicating this so that it's affecting change. Now, with that, I mean, most of our church folks are very supportive and right on board. But to find those people, whether it's in the city, in my neighborhood, or in my church, that don't think that way, it hurts me to the core of my. That's a pain to me that's very different from Jason's pain, because it's not a person.
It's about the same, brother. Because I've been trying to discover what in the world is it that these folks go to church Sunday in, Sunday out, small groups. They even have some quiet devotion time. Mm-hmm. Like, how is it that we miss it? How is it that this guy that I'm talking to, I know his heart for Jesus, but yet he's so blinded to how he's viewing the struggle in the African American community? And I recently went back to a verse like, oh, I got it. It's 2 Peter chapter 1, where he said, hey, add these different character qualities to you, these virtues. Mm-hmm. And the last two, he says, brotherly kindness and love. And then he goes on to say, if these things are in you and increase, you can see. But if they're not, you're blinded and cannot see afar off. Yeah. And I think that's what happens. I wrestle. How in the world can we be so blind to the racial disparities, whatever you want to call it, in our country, and particularly in the body of Christ and Christians? How is it that this stuff is so prevalent? When it's prevalent, it's super obvious and heavy and thick. Yeah. And it's ultimately is because we limit the area that we allow Jesus to impact. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, it is hard because it's like when some of these issues come up, the natural reaction is defensiveness. Well, that's not, I'm not. And it's like, wait a minute. We're all flawed. All of us three included,
absolutely.
we're all flawed. So to me, it's like, wouldn't I expect that there would be some issues? Like I probably got some stuff that I don't know about, I don't see, I don't recognize. And then you add on top of that, the whole nature of the gospel is reconciliation.
Yeah.
Reconciling us with God, reconciling us with others. We've been given the ministry of reconciliation, Paul says. Well, the only way you can reconcile is to hear people on the other side. As I heard Andy Stanley say one time, the only way you can be a bridge builder is to get comfortable with footings on both sides of the divide.
That's good.
That's the only way.
Yes.
And if you're not comfortable on both sides, you're probably not going to be able to build a bridge. And so I think that's a real challenge for all of us.
Absolutely.
To be able to see the other perspective, which is part of why we're having these conversations, so we can hear each other and see from a different perspective. So if you feel yourself, as you're watching this, you feel yourself getting defensive or getting like, well, that's a really good time. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying it's a really good time to do a check-in with the Spirit of God to say, hey, am I missing something here?
Yeah.
Is there something here that I'm just not willing to see, or I'm so convinced of my position? I just think that's a really good indicator. At least it is for me. So, yeah. Anything else that you were wanting to say about that particular question? Or Jason, you were talking earlier about some of the pain.
To that point, Dr. Martin Luther King has one of his quotes at the
And he's got some good ones.
Man.
When
I saw this at the memorial in D.C. for the first time 2 years ago, I started crying. Because when I looked at it, I said, I'm not crazy. And it starts off by saying, if we're to have peace on earth, our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. And the idea is the ecumenical is the idea of the church coming together. Rather than sectional. It's you've got your section of folks, you've got your section, I've got my section. Right. And that's typically why we don't want to listen, is because I got to prove that my section is right on this issue. So as soon as you raise that issue or raise that name, I got to prove to you why that position is wrong. And I can't hear you. I can't listen to you.
Yeah, that's good. So you guys as bridge builders, unifiers, looking at the social landscape in our country right now, the political divisiveness, I think the news media certainly doesn't help with all that. As we look at the overall frame for you, what do you hope for? Where do you see hope? Just talk about that a little bit. Jeff, why don't you start?
Well, and I've expressed to Jason, aren't things getting any better? I mean, this is frustrating. Boy, I'm tired of this conversation after 30 years. Yes. But I'll tell you what, again, my inconvenience of talking about it. But I'm excited for the areas where there's been movement. I'm excited that right now it's captured the hearts and minds of people. And we've been part of conversations to question, why is it now? Really, does it take one more person to die for everyone suddenly to realize? But I do think we're at a space where, with the availability of social media, the ease of videoing something, that there are people who have dismissed it. And again, I want to trust their hearts. It's, I think, because they heard part of the story, they didn't believe it in total. Oh, well, there's got to be another side to it, that they've been able to dismiss it up to this point. Now you can't. You can't dismiss that it exists. You can't dismiss that it's real.
Dismiss that incident for sure.
Right.
It's really obvious.
And so my hope is that we're at a point that we've got more people's attention and that something will change. I think that people, I hope they're realizing that it doesn't come unless you build relationships.
Yeah.
If you don't know any people of color, if you don't know anyone outside of your own culture in your community, because they exist, they're there, whether you acknowledge it or not. But you know that, and not just make it about, well, that's the ethnicity of my dry cleaner, or that's that my neighbor who is a person of color, but you actually build a relationship with that person, with this staff member at church, with that person who sits across from me in the pew. That until you build those relationships, you will always stay secluded. Yeah. And you have to be intentional about it. And I hope right now that, and you've talked about the white checks and all of your white friends who've checked in on you kind of a thing to see how you're doing. I mean, I hope this leads to deeper relationships. I hope it leads to people being able to cross the hall, cross the driveway, cross the street, and be able to build a relationship with someone that they care about. Or that they want to care about, and realize that we're people, and especially in the body of Christ, when it's other believers, that we should really care about others, and it involves education, it involves conversations, it involves tough conversations where you got to go, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was offensive. It's okay to say I didn't realize that. Right. And apologize, and we move forward with it. But unless you have that conversation, you don't get to that reality, and nothing changes.
Yeah, I just agree so much. And I think one of the things that is so hard for us as humans to do is to go into a conversation and genuinely ask questions without an agenda.
Yeah, right.
Because a lot of times it's like, I'm asking these questions to get to my point that I want to make with you about how I see your situation.
Pastors never do that.
No. But to genuinely go into a conversation with somebody who's different from you, asking open-ended questions, where there's it's a safe space. You can tell me how you feel, and I'm not going to be defensive or attack you or whatever. That's a big deal.
And you have to believe the experience you hear, not start to make excuses for why. Well, you know what? I got called names too. Yeah. I don't know what your problem is with being called a name. You know, but actually listen and try and empathize and understand, why does that name affect you more than me getting called a name? Right. What does that mean that's different than shame or bullying that would happen to me? And I think unless you put yourself in those shoes and ask those, you know, I always call it the question behind the question. Ask the next question so that you have that understanding. If not, the first question you get answered, there's too many things you can second guess,
and you're going to lay you discount it in your mind.
You lay your understanding on it unless you can push past your understanding and start to understand another person's perspective, which always takes the second question. And if you don't do that, then you'll never understand. And I think I hope that's happening now. I really believe it is.
It's good. I hope so too. Jason, what about you? What are your hopes as you look at the current climate?
Hopes is the right word.
Yes.
The plural form. I think of two right off. One echoes what Jeff said. But the first one, I said, my hopes are that we stop assuming that terms mean something. And a lot of the conversations that I've had lately, it's one term will be brought up. Hey, there's this term. I don't even believe this term. I don't believe that this term exists.
Systemic racism, or whatever the term is.
Let's take systemic racism for instance. Like, I have some friends that are police officers. Some of the uncles in my family now are mentors that are of my boys. And one of them called me, a white police officer, said, Jason, I need to talk. I'm frustrated right now. I saw this case presented by the DA in Atlanta, and as a police officer, I feel like it was one-sided. And as I said, okay, go. Now, granted, when I first got the text, I had to wait a little while before I responded, just because I'm not ready for conversation number 17 yet.
Yeah.
So I let him talk. Once I called, I said, go ahead. I'm listening, man. And I heard him. And I made sure I heard him. And And once I heard him, I said, man, from your perspective, I see exactly what you're saying. Consider this perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we got to talk, it's like, man, this term systemic racism, I hate that term. I don't even think it exists. And like, wait, hold on. Let's take that term off the table.
There you go.
Yeah.
And let's just talk about the history that you learned.
Mm-hmm.
The things that you've learned in school, as opposed to what I've had to, how my wife and I have had to make a supplementary curriculum to help my kids understand who they are. Okay, let's look at this historical perspective. Because if you're not learning to value a particular race in your history, when you start doing other things, you're already going to have a bias. And you can't necessarily put your finger on that bias. Mm-hmm. Do you want to call that systemic? You call it what you want to. It ain't right. And it just creates this wall when we use certain terms. I think terms have to be defined. Mm-hmm. But even let's say Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, as soon as I can't even say matter anymore. If I went to a restaurant, what kind of sauce you want? It doesn't matter. What do you mean it doesn't matter? Does Polynesian matter? Or like come on, man. So I wish we could talk and stop trying to put a broad definition on every scenario, every single situation. I think that would help the conversation. My other hope is that people who say that they believe in Jesus would actually start living like it in the way that they approach relationships. Amen. There's this verse in Romans that says, rejoice or celebrate with those who celebrate and weep with those who weep. Mm-hmm. The ultimate question is, even though you may not agree with a person or the uproar of their community, can you understand what their heart is saying as their heart is broken? Yeah. Can you do that?
Can you weep with them?
Right. Can you weep with them? Mm-hmm. And in order to weep, as we just said, it takes listening. The other thing is in I can't talk, I need some water. Developing authentic relationships. I look at, as you mentioned, the Apostle Paul. God was using Paul to write scriptures to the Corinthians. He wrote a letter. And in the letter, as God was breathing, causing him to write this stuff, he said, I long to be with you. Mm. As he was writing a letter to Timothy, the God-breathed word, he's telling Timothy to come and see him as soon as he can. Mm-hmm. And what I saw with that is, like, even though we do have God's word, that doesn't replace physical human relationships. Yeah. And God designed us for those human relationships to grow in this authentic spiritual way. Yeah. And only when we develop those relationships and begin to go out of our way to come back and go see those Pauls or to go see those Corinthians will we begin to allow some of those scales that are on our eyes fall off.
It's really good. It's very good. Beautiful. Mm-hmm. Well, as we wrap this up, guys, anything else you want to say or put out there as we close out here?
Well, I think one of the key things is to understand how when you hurt anyone else in your community, that it always comes back and it hurts you. Mm-hmm. That even for those who are racist or those who think there are lines that have to be drawn, they don't realize how that hatred comes back and impacts them and people they care about. Mm-hmm. I think about for those who don't know their history, in the city of Montgomery, there's one of the most beautiful parks that was ever developed. It began in the late 1800s and grew in the 1900s, and it had a wonderful zoo that was sort of world class. There was a giant swimming pool, and it became a beautiful park that was used by the residents of Montgomery, but it wasn't, it was not segregated, and as a product of its time, it was all white, no people of color were allowed in, and
so black... So it was segregated?
It was, yes, I say it backwards,
there you go.
Sorry, thank you. Sorry.
I thought he was saying, like, even the trees were white.
Yes,
I was like, wow.
Sorry. Anyway, and so what happened was some African Americans in the community got together and they filed a lawsuit. And the Supreme Court came back and said that that had to be open to everyone. And the city fathers at the time filled the pool and they sold off all the animals in the zoo. They hurt their own families because of their bias, because of their unjust views. These people made a decision who impacted their own kids and grandkids,
the whole city
who
suffered.
didn't get to see, right, that, and I think people don't see that all the time, that your hateful attitude, and you think you're speaking out against someone over here, and what you don't realize is that you are hurting those who are closest to you. It hurts when there are racist views, unjust views in the church. It hurts the whole church. And I, that's my heart cry.
And that's no
for
matter
people.
what color we are.
That's right. That you don't understand that if we can't be united,
Yeah.
that we are not being who we've been called to be.
Yeah.
And it hurts our witness. It hurts our ability to love. It hurts our ability ever to hope to be like Christ.
Absolutely.
When we can't do that. And I think of Proverbs 3:27, that whenever it is in your right to do good, if you have the opportunity to do good to someone, to not withhold that good. And I would say that there is the heart cry of what we should be as believers. That I don't have to pray about this. Well, let me pray about it and get back to you with how I feel about this. There are some things that you never have to pray about. That if it is within your power to do good, then you do it. That's our call in life. And I wish we'd, I don't think we have to do as much talking and as much praying about the stuff if we just did what was right and what God has called us to do. That's sort of my heart cry in this at the end of the day.
Man. Thank you so much. Jason, what about you?
So my wife and I are into this family history stuff. My wife is big on family DNA and going back. So we're looking at history. And so in my history, there's this uncle. And he went on this journey. He was very wealthy, went on this journey, and he stumbled upon this amazing house. He loved this house. He was like, you know what? I want to own this house. So he did everything that he could to take ownership of this house. But he didn't have any children of his own, so he called all his nieces and nephews. He said, I want y'all to come live in this house with your uncle. And so the nieces and nephews came, and then he realized he needed to establish some order in his house. So he got some of his kids to help. Some of them, gave him different jobs. And there were some of his nieces and nephews, he wouldn't pay them. He just give them housing, but wouldn't pay them for the work. And then one day, those nieces and nephews said, hey, we need to get paid. We need to stop working for free. So he's like, you know what, you're right. So he started giving them wages. But then he didn't let these particular nieces and nephews eat at the table with the other nieces and nephews. So then they started like, okay, you paying us, uncle, but now we want to eat at the same table. So they're like, okay. So he let them start eating at the same table. But then they started fussing because the uncle wouldn't let them upstairs. Only other certain nieces and nephews could go upstairs. And then everybody started saying, yeah, that's kind of wrong. You probably should let them come upstairs. So they came upstairs. And then these same nieces and nephews saying, well, you don't let us in the master bedroom. And you don't let us go in the other drawers, the junk drawers. You only let them. And he said, well, I let y'all, started paying you all. I let y'all eat at the table. I let you upstairs. Now you want the master bedroom. And they started fussing about that. The problem was the uncle had been telling all of the nieces and nephews that the house belonged to them equally. And that uncle is named Sam. And that's the story of America. And I just think if we begin to look at all of us as siblings or as cousins living in our uncle's house, Uncle Sam of America, that God has given to us, let go of the master bedroom. Start sharing the same table. Give everybody just the same amount of equality, the same amount of care.
Thank you.
That's good.
Yeah.
So We're wrapping up these conversations for for June, and we'll be back in August. But before I let you go, I just wanted to mention that as pastors in the Wiley-Saxe community, we're going to be gathering with whoever wants to come this Sunday night. What is the date? June 28th?
28th, yes.
Just Sunday night, June 28th at 7 p.m. at Old City Park for an hour. Just going to be an hour. It's going to be an hour to pray. And we're just going to pray for unity in our city, pray for our state, pray for our nation, pray for our world, that God would bring us together and that we would be those bridge builders. And rather than building walls, we build bridges, and we be unifiers rather than dividers. And I believe that's exactly what the heart of God is. Thank you guys so much for being here with us. Thank you for being there Sunday night. It's going to be a great time. I hope you'll be there, and I hope you'll share this with the people. And let's do this together, guys. We're so much better together. So much better together. Thank you so much for being a part of this, and I hope you have a great week.
We're so much better together.